Welcome back to another episode of Sorry for Rambling. I'm Alex Cack, and I'm joined today by Shawn Howard, who is running for president. Shawn, how are you doing?
Good, Alex. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing great. The first question is, why do it?
Sure. I've always been a political junkie, so I've been seeing over the last number of years the political left and the political right are just diverging tremendously, and there's really just a massive rift in the country, it seems. And Washington, D.C. politicians, especially in the Senate and Congress, especially of late, they're really just appeasing the hard left and the hard right of their parties, and the mainstream media just goes right along with it. And I'm more of a moderate, independent type of view. I see a little bit on the left and a little bit on the right, and I think that's where most people are, is in the middle. Even though you've got this vocal minority on either side, I think most people just want fair and reasonable decisions to what the problems that are in front of us. And that's where I kind of come in, and I think I'm more of a fiscal conservative and socially liberal, kind of toe the line right in the middle. But moderates have kind of been dying off in the last number of years. So I think that was I just wanted to be able to run and try to bring people back together and not let the country just kind of rip apart into this extreme radical side of one party or the other.
It's an interesting thing, I think, that we're seeing right now, and I'm curious to hear your take on this, because there's a lot of people, on the left who hear arguments like that, and they tend to say, well, yes, but the country moved so far to the right that what we think of as moderates now were the conservatives of yesteryear, and I'm curious to hear what your take is on that.
Well, I think people on the right would probably say the exact opposite, that the country's been moving left for a number of years, and the Democratic Party has shifted exceedingly left in the last, say, 3 years, 4 years. So it depends on your perspective, I suppose. I think both left and right will make the exact counter argument to that.
Well, I mean, to some extent, you're right. When it comes to the rhetoric, they do say it's true, but I mean, there is precedent there. I mean, when we talk about going to the left, I think some of the stylistic rhetoric has changed. When you think about people like Bernie Sanders, like they try to sound maybe a little more like a, campus hippie from the 1960s.
But Bernie used to be by himself for the most part as the standalone senator on the hard left, whereas most of the party was not really with him. And with his campaign in 2016, he made a lot of progress, and he's had a lot of people that he supported over the last 4 years that have kind of come up. Now you have AOC, and you've got some other people on that progressive left, the Bernie Sanders side, and between the two of them, they've supported a number of candidates in different districts, and they're building that wing of the Democratic Party, whereas you didn't really see that prior to 2016. Bernie's always been the senator votes a certain way and never really got anything passed. But now in two different campaigns, he's really gotten a following. Well, and a lot of people are shifting in his direction.
He's really restructured, I think, the ideological shift. He's and I guess that's kind of my point is, a lot of the policies that wing is advocating from an economic standpoint, they really wouldn't have been out of touch with with what we think of as the mainstream of the Democratic Party from, say, the 30s through the 70s even.
Well, it depends which policy you're talking about. I mean, they're now looking at UBI and paying back student loans, where that really wasn't discussed 5 years ago. UBI wasn't really discussed until Andrew Yang came along.
Well, yes, but
Medicare for all is another one.
We almost had a UBI bill pass on a bipartisan basis in the 70s. So I think people forget sometimes how far economically the country shifted so rapidly during that period of time. I mean, you talk about Medicare for all. I mean, that's the label we put on it, but single-payer health care, pretty much every president between Theodore Roosevelt and LBJ talked about some similar single-payer plan. And it wasn't really till Nixon we started to see a break in it. So it's kind of interesting how how quickly these things have shifted. And I mean,
Right.
we tend to think of like Reagan as a figure who really shifted that conversation to the right, and in a lot of ways it almost feels like Bernie is, well, he didn't win, but he's filling that
Oh,
same role.
16, but not as much this time around.
Not at all.
And he knew it. So and he's friends with Biden, so he bowed out a lot more graciously than he did the last time around.
I think
But I
that
think just the rhetoric is so toxic from both sides, and you've got completely different news sources where people are getting their information from. And if you flip from Fox to CNN, you'd think you're in two different countries, even though they might be talking about the same topic. On one side, there's nothing wrong with Trump and Obama's the devil. And on the other side, it's the complete opposite of that. Hillary's the devil, or Hillary's great, Obama's great, and Trump is the worst thing ever. And there's no in between. And it's really hard to find a media source, especially televised, that tries to give you something remotely close to neutral.
I mean, that I think is an incredibly valid point. And we're talking about kind of the historical partisan breakdown. That wasn't really something that they too much had to factor with. I mean, there were extremists in talk radio going all the way back to the foundations of talk radio in the 20s, but they were fringe. They had fringe audiences. When you had small newspapers that would put out these really hard left or hard right opinions, but they played to very small audiences, and I think they were often understood to be looking at something through a perspective lens, even by their readership or listeners. They understood that they weren't getting the unfiltered truth; they were getting someone's opinion.
Right, and I think that's still true to some extent on radio, where you've got it just lends itself to more fringe elements of, especially on the right, for radio anyway.
Oh yeah, and well, but it's lost. I think we've lost the dividing line between news and journalism and editorial opinion. For someone like yourself that's trying to run as a consensus candidate, how do you navigate that kind of atmosphere, that media atmosphere?
Well, the media atmosphere can be difficult. I mean, the journalists on both sides tend to be pretty fair. It's when you start getting into the talking heads where where you kind of deviate away from your pure journalist into the people that are talking on CNN or Fox past 8 o'clock, where they're purposely partisan, purposely trying to drum up their base. So, but the regular media outside of the major networks with the opinion people, they tend to be a lot more fair than most. I mean, they're going to have their opinions, and I've talked to a handful of them on the right or the left, but they're more pure journalists as opposed to some of what we're seeing on cable networks.
Yeah, on the subject of journalism, and kind of to get into some of the some policy questions with you, one thing that strikes me is we're seeing the kind of erosion of local journalism. Local papers are in financial straits. They're often being bought up by outside companies that don't have a history in media or press. We see the same thing going on in a different way with local news networks and local news stations, where they're being bought up by large companies and they're laying off employees and journalists and being given prepackaged syndicated newsreels, often with an ideological bias. Do you think that there's a policy solution to try to protect these local news sources that are invaluable to our democracy?
Well, I mean, you can look at acquisitions the same way. If large corporations are trying to buy each other, you want to get away from monopolies and oligopolies. So, I mean, you can look at a lot of different websites, news websites across the country, and you'll notice pretty quickly that they're owned by the same company, because the format of the website's exactly the same, and a number of other things that just tell you that one company owns it all. So there's ways you can structure policy to make sure that the DOJ is reviewing every type of acquisition that comes through, or to make sure that you don't own a certain percentage of the overall media or the overall newspaper industry, let's say. Just in the same way they do with banks in a lot of countries, where you can't own more than 10% of the deposits of the country, or the loans or whatnot. So that's a way to be able to do it from a legislative point of view. and hopefully that would protect some level of local journalism. But I think we're probably past that. There's very few companies now that are running all these local newspapers and local online news sites. So it's hard to backtrack from the point we're at now.
Is kind of trust busting these hedge funds that are buying up newspapers? Is that something that you think you might support?
I'd have to look at it on a case by case basis. I don't think it's the hedge funds as much, but I'd have to take a look to see who's really buying the newspapers. I think Sinclair is one, if I know off the
Yeah.
top of my head there, but I don't know if that's run by a hedge fund. I'd have to take a look.
No,
Uh,
Sinclair is more of a straight media group. The thing that we're seeing is, because we had in the paper business, they had, Gannett and all these different groups that were in their own way large companies, but they at least had a background in media, and we're trying to run a profitable enterprise. And what we've seen is there are hedge funds that are buying out these papers, and it's kind
they're
of
gutting the journalists. Yeah, I mean, you see
yeah.
it's not politics, but they did it in Sports Illustrated, where they basically just got rid of all the real journalists and decided they wanted to hire a bunch of 20-year-olds at an hourly rate, and
Yep.
just as long as they could churn as many articles as they can, because it's all about clicks and advertising off of those clicks. So the newspapers themselves are not generating the revenue, at least moving forward. It's more eyeballs on the websites. So in order to do that, they're just hiring cheap and throwing out as many articles as humanly possible. And as a reader, you can tell for the most part, these article that I would read and I'd say, well, I could have written that in 5 minutes. There's no research. It's just, rambling for a few paragraphs or so just to get a click, and they get a nice catchy headline to make you want to click into it, which might have nothing to do with what it is that they're talking about. But that
Sports
seems to be the
Illustrated is a
progression.
really good example of that, actually.
I'm sorry?
Sports Illustrated is a really good example of that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, they had mostly a mutiny when they went through it, but then it was a 48-hour news story, and then that's it.
It was
And,
gone.
and the owners did what they wanted to do, and I don't know where it is at this point, but I assume that's still the platform that they're trying to run. But that's generally what the hedge funds have been trying to do. I don't know to what extent that they own the news media, but a lot of it is how many clicks can you get, how many articles can you get up there on the site.
Yeah. Well, and I want to let's pivot into other. That was a transition, kind of into asking you where you stand on certain things, but let's just get right into it. You describe yourself as kind of a moderate. What are things that you would pursue if elected? What are you campaigning on?
My number one platform would be term limits. So, we can see that we have term limits in governors and in the presidency, obviously, but we don't have any of that in Congress or in the Senate. So you've got people that are there for 35, 45 years. There's senators right now that are in their 80s that have been there forever. And I just think that you need to avoid complacency, arrogance, corruption to put a set term limit on these people that are coming into Congress, because that's what tends to lead to the complete breakdown in communication. It comes from the leadership on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, and they've been there forever, so they don't really feel the need to work with their partners. Whereas if you look at, say, the freshmen that came in this past Congress, there were 100 freshmen that came in, and they are much more idealistic. They're much more willing to work with the other side. AOC, for example, she's the most well-known, obviously. She's trying to work with Ted Cruz to ban lawmakers from doing lobbying after they come out, and that's another policy that I would support. But just that style of cooperation and working with people, I think term limits would make a big difference in that. So I would propose for senators to just have 2 terms at 6 years each, and the opposite for congressmen, 6 terms of 2 years. So it still gives you 12 years on either side of the house to be able to enact your policy, whatever it is you want to do. But it gives other people a chance to get in there and get fresh blood and new ideas. And I think that's what the country is really starving for.
I mean, I think you're absolutely correct. I don't think there's many people who are opposed to term limits, frankly. talking about some of these kind of big banner issues. I mean, we've been debating healthcare policy for 100 years in this country, back and forth, maybe longer at this point. What would you ascribe as a healthcare reform policy moving forward?
Well, I mean, overall, there's not an easy solution to this, but at least to start, I would allow for the government to negotiate prescription plan pricing in Medicare. So Medicare is a huge program where basically the government is basically the biggest customer for all the pharmaceutical companies, but they don't negotiate any of the prices. So there's actually some level of partisan agreement on being able to do that. I think it just got stuck because they don't really pass a lot of legislation. And they have differences on how to do it. I think the Democrats wanted to force them into it, whereas the Republicans wanted more of a pure negotiation. But that's one step where you could get prescription drug prices a lot lower. Another step is to oversee the doctors to make sure that they're prescribing what they're supposed to prescribe. For example, I had an opioid prescription about 15 years ago, and it was just a simple thing I needed, and they gave me like 60 pills. I went back, I finished through them in like 10 years, 12 years, or whatever it was, went back, and you can see that there's a difference where at least the person I talked to said, okay, well, how many do you need? And it ended up being, you get 8. So that's part of, at least has to be done on a national level, where the doctors need to be held accountable in terms of what they're prescribing and how much to each individual patient. And you can't just randomly prescribe it as if it was candy. That helps with the opioid addiction, among other things, but it helps in terms of lowering the amount of prescriptions that are unnecessary prescriptions that are being fulfilled. But beyond that, I would probably just try to work off of ACA right now and try to just get more people covered if possible. Take the existing structure that we have and try to work off of that.
When talking about prescriptions, you kind of bring it to an interesting point, and I'm curious, what are your views on the ongoing drug war?
You mean illegal drug war?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I mean, we're waging a war often on drugs that are manufactured for legal use and then illegally and recreationally used. We are fighting illegal drugs, both domestically made and coming across our border, and we're incarcerating a lot of people.
Yeah, I think you have to differentiate between users and distributors and manufacturing. So with marijuana, let's say it's becoming legal in, I don't remember how many states we're in now, maybe 12 states where it's legal recreationally, and it's legal by prescription in the majority of the states. But when you start getting into the heavier drugs, you're incarcerating a lot of people that might just be using it in their basement and not much else. So I think you have to differentiate from the person who's trying to sell it as opposed to the person who's just the end user. And I don't think it's really necessary to incarcerate the non-violent user, but you still need to get rid of the source, or at least try to limit the amount of drugs coming into the country. So it's not something that the U.S. has been very successful at, obviously. There's a ton of cocaine, heroin, et cetera, that comes into the country. And I know, like, a libertarian side, they don't want a war on drugs at all, but I think you still need to have some amount of enforcement to try to get most of the drugs, or as much of the drugs, off the street as you can. But yeah, and to your point, you got to be careful as to who you want to incarcerate.
And so, and just to be clear, I mean, you are against legalization on a broad swath. Are you for legalization of certain drugs and against the legalization of others?
Yeah, I would be in favor of legalization of marijuana, but against the majority of the other ones. So I actually was in Massachusetts. I'm originally from Massachusetts, where we voted for recreational marijuana. I voted in favor of that. Down here in Florida, I believe it's available by prescription only. So they haven't really got that far yet. Massachusetts, it took a couple of years before they got to stores, and it was a little bumpy in terms of what they passed versus what actually came out a couple of years later. But yeah, I would be in favor of that. I mean, it's not a huge drive in my campaign, but I'd be in favor of that and against the rest.
I want to kind of pivot to another big issue, which is the environment. We're seeing
Sure.
if we're seeing the effects of climate change. We're now living in that period of time. We see droughts. We're seeing superstorms. What actions would you take to help mitigate those effects?
A couple things. First, I would reinstate the United States into the Paris Climate Accord. Virtually every country in the world is in the Paris Climate Accord, and we were up until recently. There, it is, some stringent numbers to get to. I think it's by 2050, but we are one of the top polluters in the country or in the world, so it's would be pretty fair for us to at least be in the accord and take some leadership there. The other aspect I would and in my policy is basically tax neutral. So I'm interested in not raising any taxes, but raising it where you could change consumer behavior as long as there's an offset. So I would propose raising the gasoline tax 50 cents a year for 10 years and take the revenue from that and lower marginal income tax brackets. So, and what that would do is raise gas prices to say $7.50 a gallon by the time 2030, 2031 rolls around, and give people enough time to shift from, say, a large SUV to a smaller one, or a small SUV to a sedan or an electric vehicle. And that would really help with the amount of pollution that's coming out, at least from mobile source air pollution. It's a little more challenging at stationary source air pollution, but you can put a lot of incentives in for solar panels and geothermal solutions, geothermal is a little bit more expensive, but if you've got enough tax credits in there, you can get some companies to move in that direction. So just things you can change with the tax policy without raising taxes in a net form, and being able to lower income tax brackets. So we've obviously raising gas taxes would be hurtful for the working class, but if you're able to lower the income brackets, the taxes on the lower income brackets as you're going along, that would help in the offset and gives people enough time to shift.
You might be the only person who's ever ran for any office in America on the platform of I'm $7.50 gallons of gas.
Well, in 10 years, so 50 cents next year and 50 cents the year after. But it changes consumer behavior. I mean, we saw when oil went to $145 a barrel, West Texas, the price of a gallon of gasoline went to about $4.25 nationally, and you could see demand destruction across the country. And people were not shifting from your massive SUV to a Prius, but they were going from their massive SUV to maybe a mid-sized SUV, and the people in large sedans were going to smaller sedans, and so on and so forth. So they were basically going down a class to get better fuel economy. And that was happening at $4.25 a gallon. Granted, that was about 10 years ago. So you could figure out the inflation level of what it is today. But it wouldn't take much to get consumers to move in the direction of electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles to lower the amount of oil that's being consumed in the automobile industry without burying the U.S. government in a huge spending program.
Well, I think one thing that we have to touch on with the environment, this almost goes back to the news media question we were talking about earlier. But if you go back just to the 80s, there was largely bipartisan consensus on the science of climate change, especially amongst members of Congress and elected officials. That has obviously drastically changed over the last 30, 40 years. How would you combat that? And how would you try to deal with those kind of forces that say, this isn't real, it's not happening?
Well, I think the science has got to be leading the same way you got to lead with science and coronavirus, but you've got to lead with the science and try to explain to the people that are that don't believe in it, I suppose, that it is coming to pass. But at the same time, it's not something that's going to end the world in the next 2 years. So, if you take, say, what the hard left is advocating and says we need to get this all finished by 2030, a lot of people would say, whereas the right is saying, okay, maybe I don't believe it, maybe I do, but we definitely don't need it by 2030, at least in terms of how much money the government has to spend to get to a particular place in terms of emissions or fossil fuels and things like that. So you really just have to balance the two. I don't think the right, for the most part, necessarily doesn't believe in climate change. I think they just don't see it as an imminent threat. So I believe if you are able to talk to both sides and just try to come up to an agreement where you can put policies in place to get us moving in the right direction without breaking the bank, I think the conservatives would come along and the left would come along as well. And in moderation, and when you're compromising, neither side really has everything that they want, but I think there is enough agreement between the two classes that you could find some policy moves that you could make.
I think brings us to another interesting point when you talk about the science leading, which is, of course, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. If you were to win, when you were sworn in president, this would very likely still be going on. What would you plan to do to address it?
Well, the biggest problem that we've had and was not really addressed was testing and contact tracing. So if you look at the countries that were successful, especially early on, especially in the Asian countries, it was testing, and trace everybody that person came in contact with. And even 6 months in, we really don't see that here. We definitely don't see it in Florida. We have increased testing, but it's not nearly as robust as it should be. For example, they actually stopped testing on Thursday. So you might notice that Florida cases have dropped tremendously in the last couple of days because a tropical storm was coming. So they decided on Thursday afternoon they were just going to stop testing across most of the state, and they won't resume testing until Tuesday afternoon, some places Wednesday. So for a tropical storm that did not hit Florida, that was gone in one day, they decided to shut down testing for 5 or 6 days, which is the exact opposite of what you need to be doing. You need to be tripling the amount of testing that you're doing. And then once you find the positive cases, you need to trace that, and you need to take the money that they're talking about right now, that they're going to go and give direct payment to all the Americans and all the other money that, they're already north of $1 trillion. You don't need $1 trillion to get robust testing and contact tracers hired across the country to get control of this. And we should have done it a long time ago. Now it's much more widespread. If you listen to Dr. Birx, even though she's getting crushed in the media right now, she said we're at a different stage now, and she's right, where it's much more widespread. There's much more community spread beyond, say, your major cities. That really is where it started. So that's really what you got to do. You got to test, you got to contact trace, and then isolate the people that are positive.
Now, there's been huge economic repercussions to all of this. How would you address and try to kind of rebuild that economy? We're seeing a bunch of bad records being set. Let's just to be candid here. Yeah. And there's fear that we could be in for a potentially long-term recession, if not depression, even if we were to come out of the pandemic and kind of reopen fully. How do you address, these kind of myriad of economic factors that are impacting us all at the same time?
Well, broadly speaking, they're doing what they're supposed to, at least without getting into specifics, in that when you force basically all the restaurants and bars and gyms and et cetera to close down, the federal government's got to step in, and the Federal Reserve has to step in and provide the liquidity and provide the money to get us through to the other side. So that's kind of what we're seeing. That's why the stock market is skyrocketing, because there's so much money getting pumped into the system that there's, people that were servers are getting a little bit more money than they were when they were working, which is fine in general. But there's so much displacement right now with workers. GDP was down 32% in the last quarter. Obviously that's going to bounce back. But it's a tricky situation to figure out how much money the government's got to spend versus how long this pandemic is going to last. And part of the problem is they've spent so much money on stuff that they don't necessarily need, and it's not really as directed as it needed to be. It's much more of a sloppy, get this done and get a bunch of pet projects done on either side that probably has, or some of which has nothing to do with the pandemic and how to get us out of the how to get us into a better state economically.
Proverbial pork.
I'm sorry?
The proverbial pork.
Right. For example, if you look at the unemployment comp, it's $600 a week. Federal aid ended on July 31st, but they don't take into account that these states pay vastly different unemployment benefits. So Florida is among the worst. I think it's about $275 a week. And Massachusetts, where I used to live, is among the best. And a lot of the Northeast is much higher. And that was like $600 a week. So there's no thought given to, okay, let's get a certain dollar amount and even everything out state to state. It's just here's $600 a week, and we don't want to deal with anything that's too complicated. And you could have targeted that a lot better, saved a lot, and helped out the people in the states that are not getting the same types of benefits, especially in the South, that they're getting in the Northeast, and equalized it a little bit better than what they're doing.
Well, and there's a lot of concern about the dominoes that are kind of set up to fall here, because as we've shut things down, we've impacted a lot of livelihoods. At the same time that we have record levels of consumer debt, kind of across the boards, be it medical debt, student loans, home and auto is always in the background, and we also are seeing foreclosures again. We're seeing we're looking at a record-setting number of rental evictions about to happen. And frankly, potentially a housing market crash in the near future, both for real estate sales and rentals. How do we prevent this? And if we're not able to prevent it in time, how do we rebound from it quickly?
Well, I think a lot of states are going to prevent evictions. I don't think that's a federal mandate, but a lot of states are stepping in and doing a moratorium on evictions. So that's buying people time. The problem with that is the landlords are not always big conglomerates. Sometimes it's just a guy who owns, a duplex or a couple duplexes. So that person still has to pay their mortgage, and they're in trouble too if they don't get the rent. So, basically you really have to, getting back to the unemployment, you really have got to cover people until we're back to levels that are a little bit more reasonable in terms of unemployment levels. And the economy is in much better shape, because then in theory, to use your example, the renter should have money coming into them in order to pay the rent, provided that the federal government is giving them those funds in the interim. But you can't do it forever, and we're running out massive deficits. We're 27 trillion or whatever the number is. So we need to get back on course. But in the meantime, we do need to watch the renters, and we need to take care of the people that are most adversely affected right now. And it's the small companies too. The large companies, they're mostly fine. If you look at Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Google, who run the stock market effectively, everyone who's sitting at home, those companies do fine. But the small companies that are the restaurants, the bar owners, the fitness clubs, most of them are the ones that are suffering. And there was another sloppy government program with the loans to small businesses. But there was too many strings attached to those, and those companies some took the loans and some didn't, because you've got to pay them back if under certain conditions. And not every market is exactly the same. If you're a New York City restaurant, the rent you're paying is a lot different than if you're in Omaha, Nebraska, let's say. But the government just put this program together and said you're allowed to do, I think it was 2 months of your rent. And there's just not a lot of thought into one market versus another and what they can do for that. And now we're at a point where some of these businesses are closing down again, and they need more support. So hopefully that comes through in the next COVID relief bill. But it needs to be more targeted versus some of the ones that have come out in the past 6 months.
I want to pivot to kind of you as a person. You describe yourself as a moderate, but have you ever identified or been registered as a voter with any of the major parties?
I've been an independent my entire life, except for 5 minutes. When I was in Rhode Island, I walked in and voted in the Republican primary for Lincoln Chafee, and I walked out and became an independent again.
I mean, to be fair, a lot of people in a lot of different political parties have voted for Lincoln Chafee in a primary.
That's true. He went from Republican to, I think he went to Democrat after that. So
I think he was an independent at one point, a Republican, a Democrat. He just ran for president as a libertarian and lost.
Right. This was at the time when he was still a Republican and hadn't changed at all, at least to my knowledge. But in order to vote in the Republican primary, I had to be a Republican, and that was the only. I think it was the only race at the time that was um, competitive. So you walk in, you sign a piece of paper that says you're no longer an independent, you're a Republican. You vote in the primary. You walk out, you sign another piece of paper that says I'm now an independent again. So aside from that, I've been an independent my entire life.
Have you ever ran for office before?
No, never.
This is the first time you decided to step all the way up highest office in the land.
Yeah, I mean, originally I thought, there's just never really good choices when you get to the general election. You typically have your two establishment candidates, and you've got a couple fringe candidates in other parties, and there never seems to be just a normal voice who just wants a reasonable and fair decision-making process. You've got establishment people, and you still have it where, Biden's been around for, I don't know, 50 years. Trump's a little different, but he's still your ideological right and your ideological left. And then you've got the Green Party, which is a little further to the left, and then the Libertarians, which, depending on who you want to argue, is a little further to the right. And that haven't really been a serious party for the most part over the course of a number of years. So I thought the country needed more choices in the general election, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to throw my name in the hat, name in the ring. And I just got tired of voting for what I see in front of me. It was Trump, Hillary, et cetera, in the last election, and it was just very disappointing.
Are you going to appear on any ballots?
Well, I'm working on it right now. I'm currently a write-in candidate officially in 24 states. I'm waiting on certification in a few more. And I'm working on full ballot access in Vermont, Colorado, Tennessee, and Louisiana. They're the easier ones to get on, although none of them are very easy. And you can actually go to my website, ShawnHoward2020.com, and it gives you a list of all the states that I'm still trying to work on to try to get on ballot access and write-in access. So obviously need a little help, especially from an electors slate of electors in different states. So I'm working on it. So far, 24 states, soon to be 27. There's only 41 that are even eligible for write-in status. 9 of them just refuse to count it. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, it's a tough sled. I mean, the two major parties purposely go out of their way to make sure that everybody else has a hard time getting on, which is, it's just the way it's going to be. It is interesting that states have completely different requirements from even a write-in status or a ballot status. So, for example, in Florida, I won't be on the actual ballot because I need 186,000 signatures, which wouldn't happen with COVID or without, but it's even harder with. However, they've already locked in their write-in candidates. So I'm one of only 8 candidates that have official write-in status in the state of Florida. But even that, they purposely make that difficult. You have a 1-week window to become a write-in candidate in the state of Florida. And a lot of the states, so even on the petition side, you've got a very narrow window to gather signatures or to submit all the documents. But that's one of the things I've been working on, and it's fascinating to me to go into each state website and try to decipher what I need and who I have to contact to get either on the ballot or the official write-in candidate.
Do you think you can win?
Well, I think I could change the conversation, hopefully, to where people can come back together and start talking and cooperate a lot more. I will be technically eligible. I should have more than 270 electoral votes where I'm an eligible candidate. So at least technically, I'd be there.
Mathematically, it's a possibility.
Mathematically, that's right.
Look, the odds might be stacked against you, but there's odds.
But that was one of my goals was to get to 270 electoral votes where I have voting eligibility. So I should have that once New York, Georgia come in, which I've already submitted the documents. They just have to, some of the states want to get through their primaries before they get to the general election. So they're all just different timelines.
Well, Shawn, thank you so much for coming on the program, and best of luck to you. Please try to stay safe on the campaign trail and keep your family safe as well.
Thank you, Alex. You do the same, and thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Pleasure was all on this end. That was Shawn Howard, independent candidate for president of the United States. This is Sorry for Rambling, and as always, I'm Alex Kack. We'll see you next time.